Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to test for moderated mediation using Andrew Hay's process macro, and in this demonstration we're going to be focusing in on process model number 7. Now before I get started, I do want to mention that underneath the video description you'll find a link to the SPSS data file that I'm going to be working from throughout this presentation, so you can download the data to follow along. You'll also find a link to a PowerPoint that's going to provide a lot more detail than I'm going to be covering in this video. So be sure to download that to learn more. So before I open up SPSS and begin running an analysis, let's consider process model number 7. So the conceptual model associated with this essentially has three variables in the primary mediation relationship. So we have sort of this mediational triangle, if you will, where we have variable x, we have a mediator, and we have variable y. And in this triangle we have paths A, B, and C prime right here. And essentially each of those paths represents a direct effect of a variable on another variable. So you see that path A reflects the direct effect of x on the mediator, path B reflects the direct effect of the mediator on the dependent variable, and then path C prime reflects the direct effect of x on y. Now in a standard mediation analysis where there's no moderator variable, we would compute the indirect effect of x on y as the product of paths A and B. And now in this particular case right here, when we add in this moderator, you'll see that the moderator has an arrow drawn to the path A. And what that's indicating is that the path A is varying across levels of the moderator. So in other words, the regression slope for path A varies depending on, again, the level of the moderating variable. And so by extension then that means that any any indirect effect that is computed would be conditional on levels of the moderator. Now in terms of estimating the coefficients for this particular model, this model can actually be broken down into two submodels, which are essentially regression models. So model 1 entails regressing the mediating variable onto variable x, the independent variable, w, which is our moderating variable, and then the interaction between x and w. So essentially then we have path A right here, and that path A, by virtue of incorporating our interaction term, we are essentially stating that path A will vary across levels of the moderating variable w. We also have model 2 where we have y that's regressed onto x and to m right here, and you can see that this regression slope would be measuring or reflecting path B, and then this regression slope would capture paths C prime right there. And I do want to mention that even though I don't include correlations in the actual diagrams, the assumption is that all of our predictor variables in those two models are correlated with each other within model. So now let's consider our example. And we are essentially going to be using data from an article by Zhou et al. From 2016. So the article the data that we're using comes from an article called Relationship Between Anxiety and Burnout Among Chinese Physicians, a Moderated Mediation Model. So we are basically going to be using the data, but this is not going to be the model that they tested in that article. Also, the scoring on the variables is a bit different from what they used in terms of their article. Okay, so now I've opened up SPSS, and you can see this is our moderating variable. Burnout's our x variable, our independent variable. Mediator is positive coping, and anxiety is our dependent variable within our model. So to perform our analysis, we're going to go to Analyze, Regression, go down to Process, and we'll first off we'll select model number 7, We'll move burnout to the X variable box. We'll move positive coping to the mediating variable. We'll move anxiety to the Y variable, and then we'll move extroversion to the moderator variable box. Under options, we'll select generate code for visualizing interactions and pairwise contrast of indirect effects. I'm also going to select mean centering. I'm going to request mean centering. We'll just go ahead and say only continuous variables that define products. And for probing any interactions, we're going to select 1 standard deviation below the mean, at the mean, and 1 standard deviation above the mean on our moderator variable. And the probe interactions is set with a p-value at less than 0.10. So if there was no, if it turned out that any conditional effect of X on the mediator within this model had a p-value that's less than 0.10, then you wouldn't see the results that are printed out. So if you wanted to get the results irrespective of whether you had significance, you could just click on something like always or some other option. But I'm going to leave it on the defaults, and we'll click continue and then on OK. So it takes a few seconds for the analysis to run. And here we are. So now let's first off just look at the general model information. So you see it says model number 7. Our Y variable is anxiety. Our X variable is burnout. Our mediator is positive coping, and the moderating variable is extroversion. So just as a general recap, the basic idea with this model is that we are proposing that the effect of burnout on anxiety is mediated through positive coping, but that mediation is moderated by extroversion, where extroversion is moderating the path between burnout and the mediator of positive coping. Okay, so the first regression results that are printed out, you'll see that we have our mediating variable, positive coping, that have been regressed onto burnout, extroversion, and the interaction between those two variables. So the int_1, you'll notice that down below it gives us product terms key, so it says burnout by extroversion, and that's what's equaling the int1. Keep in mind too that we mean centered those two variables. So when you mean center the variable, the mean is converted to a mean of 0, but the standard deviation of the original variables are exactly the same. And the mean centering affords us opportunities with respect to interpretation of our results. So you'll notice that the slopes that are given here then for our X and our W variables, these are essentially conditional effects of a given predictor on our mediator at the mean of the other predictor. So in other words, the slope of negative 0.2172 for burnout right here, that is the slope for the effect of burnout on positive coping for cases falling at the mean on extroversion. The slope for extroversion right here is essentially reflecting the effect of extroversion on positive coping for cases that would be falling at the mean on burnout. So you can see then that the slope for burnout is negative, and we have statistical significance. The slope for extroversion is positive, and we have statistical significance. So both of those conditional effects are statistically significant. Now, the most important part of this in terms of dealing with our moderator question is this interaction term right here. And we see that we have a positive slope, it's 0.22, and we also have statistical significance. So what that means is that the effect of burnout on positive coping, that slope for the relationship itself varies across levels of the extroversion variable. And also, because the interaction is actually symmetric, we could also say that the effect of extroversion on positive coping varies across levels of burnout. But to keep us consistent with our theoretical model, we're going to stick with the assumption that the effect of burnout on positive coping is moderated by extroversion. So As you scroll down a little bit further, you'll notice that we have conditional effects of the focal predictor at values of the moderator. So because our interaction term was statistically significant in our regression model, we would want to probe that interaction. So one way to do that is to compute conditional effects and then test them for statistical significance. So these are essentially referred to as simple slopes, and these are the slopes for the effect of burnout on positive coping at 1 standard deviation below the mean on extroversion, at the mean, and 1 standard deviation above the mean on extroversion. Just keep in mind we had mean centered our extroversion variable. So the mean is 0, and the 0.2912 that we have right here is equal to the standard deviation of the extroversion variable. So the reason why we have a negative 0.2912 here is because we're taking the mean, which is 0, subtracting the standard deviation to get that value, and then right here we have 0 plus 0.2912 to get that value. So we're essentially testing the effect of burnout on positive coping at those three values on the extroversion variable, and they're just three arbitrary points essentially that reflect a possible low, a possible medium, and a possible high value with respect to our extroversion variable. So this effect column right here are the simple slopes reflecting the conditional effects of burnout on positive coping. So you can see that the simple slope at 1 standard deviation unit below the mean on extroversion is negative 0.2821, and we have statistical significance here. You'll notice that the conditional slope at 1 standard deviation above the mean on the centered extroversion variable is negative 0.1524, and we see that that is statistically significant. Then you'll notice that right here at the mean it says negative 0.2172. And you'll notice that that value is exactly the same as what we had in our original regression table. And so that's what I was kind of pointing to earlier when I was referring to these effects as conditional effects within our original regression model. So you'll see then that obviously the significance test is going to yield the same result as what we had in the table above. So next we'll scroll down a little bit further, and you'll see in our output that we have some syntax that allows us to plot out the conditional effects. And so the way that we can use this syntax right here is to double click in our output, and we'll go up to where it says data list free, and we're going to highlight all of this all the way through and including the period at the end. So I'll right click and then click on copy. We'll go to File, New, and then go over to Syntax. So we're going to open up a blank syntax file. We'll paste this in, and then we can highlight all of this and click on the green arrow right here to run it. And so you'll see then that we get a plot of the simple slopes. Now, unfortunately, we can't get the lines that are to be drawn in here. So if we want to get lines in here to better visualize our slope, then we can easily do that. If we go down to at the bottom of my screen, I'm using a PC, I can find the window that contains a new data set that's been created, and this is just for the purpose of plotting out those simple slopes. So in this data set you can see that we have there's our extroversion variable, our burnout variable, and then positive coping, which is the dependent variable in that first regression analysis. So we have three levels of extroversion. There's our low, our medium, and high levels, and then for burnout we have our low, medium, and high levels here, and then these are the values that reflect those combinations. So we'll go to Graph Legacy dialog and then go down to Line. We'll click on Multiple and then Define, And I'm going to click on other statistic, and I'll move positive coping to this box right here. We'll move burnout to the category axis and extroversion down to the defined lines by box. We'll click on OK, and so now we get our plot of our simple slopes. And so as you're looking at this, keep in mind that these slopes are just a visualization of those conditional effects that we were looking at earlier. If I go back to our output and go back to the conditional effects, we saw that the slope at 1 standard deviation unit below the mean on extroversion is negative 0.28, at the mean is negative 0.2172, and then at 1 standard deviation above the mean on extroversion it's negative 0.1524. So you can see that the slope, even though it's negative across those, it becomes less pronounced as we move from low extroversion to higher extroversion. So going down and looking at our simple slopes, you can see that the blue line is reflecting 1 standard deviation below the mean on extroversion. The green line reflects the mean on extroversion, and then the red line is reflecting the slope at 1 standard deviation above the mean on extroversion. And as you can see, again, the blue line has the most pronounced negative slope. The green line has the next most pronounced slope, and then the red line has the weakest slope, even though it is still negative and statistically significant according to our conditional effects test, our simple slopes test. It's still a weaker slope than what we had with respect to our blue line. So now let's go ahead and proceed a little bit further. We'll now look at our next regression model where we have anxiety regressed onto burnout and positive coping. So in this case, these two predictors here. So you'll see we have our R-square value up here, our F value, degrees of freedom, and significance level. So the two predictors are accounting for about 26% of the variation in anxiety. And we see that burnout has a positive predictive relationship. We have a positive slope, statistically significant. And then for positive coping, you can see here that the slope is negative and statistically significant. So essentially, the direct effect of positive coping on anxiety, again, is negative and statistically significant. The direct effect of burnout on anxiety is positive and statistically significant. So we'll scroll down a little bit further then and look at our output, and you'll see in our output here that it says direct and indirect effects of X on Y. So the direct effect of X on Y, that's that C prime path that I was mentioning earlier, and you'll see that we have our t-test that's given and significance level, and that this is actually going to be the same as what we had in our second regression submodel right here. So all of this is exactly the same as what we had above. Now when we look at the indirect effects, you'll notice that we have conditional indirect effects of X on Y. So in a nutshell, you could, as you're looking at this, you can see that we have the indirect effect of our burnout variable on anxiety through our mediating variable is varying across levels of extroversion. So again, this is 1 standard deviation below the mean, at the mean of extroversion, and then 1 standard deviation above the mean on extroversion. So these are the conditional indirect effects that are computed, basically the product of path A at a given level of extroversion and path B. So that's essentially all there is. So that's why we have three that's why we have three indirect effects as opposed to just one. So we can, as you're looking at this, you can see that the conditional indirect effects seem to be getting a little bit smaller as we move from lower extroversion to higher extroversion. It starts out at 0.0382, then to 0.0294, then to 0.026. So next, if we want to test these out, we can use these bootstrap confidence intervals right here. And so the way that you carry out the test is determine if 0, which is the null conditional indirect effect, if 0 falls between the lower and the upper bound of the confidence interval, or whether it falls outside of the confidence interval. So if 0 falls between the lower and the upper bound of the confidence interval of a given confidence interval, then the conditional indirect effect would be deemed as not statistically significant. Whereas if 0 falls outside of the lower and the upper bound, then we would deem that conditional indirect effect as statistically significant. So you can see, looking at all three of these confidence intervals, that all three of those conditional indirect effects are statistically significant. Now, if you look down here, we also have a single index of moderated mediation. So essentially this is kind of combining the results from above and really provides you with an overall test of whether there is moderated mediation. And logically, it actually kind of makes sense to perhaps start with this, and then if this test is significant, then proceed to kind of looking at which of those conditional effects are statistically significant. But as you can see right here, we have the index of moderated mediation. So this is an overall index, and we can test this for statistical significance using the bootstrap confidence interval that's given right here. So using the same logic that we applied above, if 0 falls between the lower and the upper bound, then we would essentially maintain the null and conclude that there is no moderated mediation. If 0 falls outside of the lower and the upper bound, then we would conclude that there is evidence of moderated mediation. So we see that 0 falls outside of the lower and the upper bound. The lower bound is negative 0.0558, the upper bound is negative 0.0065. So we would conclude that we do have evidence of moderated mediation. When we look, again, going back up here and looking at each of these, we find that each of the conditional indirect effects are statistically significant. And then we can also go down to this next box where it says pairwise contrast between conditional indirect effects. So this allows us to kind of further probe any kind of the conditional indirect effects or probe the nature of the moderated mediation. So you can see it says effect 1 and effect 2. So what we have are the coefficients that were generated in this table above. So these effects that are right here. So you'll see that effect 1 for this first row, we have 0.0294, and effect 2 is 0.0382. So the contrast essentially is computed by taking the 0.0294, which is this coefficient, and subtracting this coefficient right here. So that's the contrast, and then we can test whether there's a significant difference in those conditional indirect effects using the bootstrap confidence interval right here. And again, we're following the same logic as what we used above with those other bootstrap confidence intervals. And so you can see right here that for this first test, or this first contrast, we see that 0 does not fall between the lower and the upper bound for the confidence interval. So we would conclude that there is a significant difference between the conditional indirect effects at 1 standard deviation below the mean on extroversion and at the mean on extroversion. The next line right here, you can see that we have 0.0206 and minus 0.0382, which gets us minus 0.0176, and we see that that difference is statistically significant. So in this case, that's basically telling us that there is a significant difference in conditional effects between the effect occurring at 1 standard deviation below the mean on extroversion and 1 standard deviation above the mean on extroversion. And you can also see that last contrast as it's essentially redundant with our first contrast, so there's not any new information that's offered right there. So at any rate, that kind of wraps up this discussion. Again, I would encourage you to check out the PowerPoint underneath the video description, and I appreciate you watching. You guys have a great day.